Hey, Lead Up listeners, Mike Harbour, another great episode of the Lead Up podcast. I'm really excited because I've got an extraordinary guest with me today. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, here's a picture of the book. It's your ship. I love the subtitle, Management Techniques from the Best Damn Ship in the Navy. I'm really looking forward. Just recently, I've had this book on my shelf for a long time. Recently picked it up and began to read it because I knew this interview was coming up with Captain Abrashoff. And I'm really excited for him to talk to us about the principles that worked for him for taking one of the worst ships in the Navy, and in a 2 year period turned it into the best ship in the Navy based on their ratings. I'm looking forward to learning how he did that and how we can transfer those concepts into our leadership today to transform our organizations, not later, but right now, today, because we need that more than ever. Captain Abrashoff, I've been saying the world is screaming for leadership, and that's never been more true than right now. And I hope that we can dive into a little bit of that topic today as well. Welcome to the Lead Up Podcast. How are you today,
Happy
my
to be
friend?
here, Mike. And before we get started, I need to tell you the backstory from Best Damn Ship in the Navy. Prior to getting command of USS Benfold, I was the #2 military assistant to the Secretary of Defense. His name was William Perry. And it was 1996. China was lobbing cruise missiles at Taiwan. And William Perry sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Strait of Taiwan, which is a very narrow body. And he was called up to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And one of the senators asked him if he was worried about putting 2 aircraft carriers in such a small body of water. And his response was, "I'm not worried. We have the best damn Navy in the world."
Hmm.
And I'm sitting behind him and I'm thinking, when I get command of the ship, I'm going to have the best damn ship and the best damn Navy. And
I
so
love
that's
it.
the back title for the backstory for the subtitle.
I love that. And you actually made that happen. You know, I'm a big believer in manifestation and putting our ideas out in the universe or whatever you want to call it, right? And then going after those things. But talk to us a little bit about your history and kind of how all that started, and then kind of just up to you taking command. I love that story. You talk about General Perry being the best leader that you've ever followed in the book, that you've been led by, and we can talk about that a little bit. But tell us a little bit about your story first of how you got to that best damn ship.
Well, I'm an accident, to be honest. I grew up in a house of 10 people, 7 women and 3 men, and we had one bathroom in our home growing up. And when I got out of the Navy and bought my first home, it has 4 bathrooms in it, and I visit every one every day just because I can. So
Yes.
the thought of me writing a book was never in the cards. But I, went to the Naval Academy and came up through the ranks and got increasingly more um, um, demanding jobs. Prior to getting command of the ship, I was the #2 military assistant to the Secretary of Defense. And the biggest life-changing event for me was the day I took command. And in the Navy, when there's a change of command ceremony, it's a big deal. Work stops a month prior, crew paints the ship from top to bottom. The admiral comes and gives a long-winded speech about how great the outgoing guy is. Whole ceremony lasts about 90 minutes. At the end of the ceremony, as my predecessor was leaving the ship for the final time with his parents and his wife and his kids, and as his departure was announced on the public address system, my new crew stood and cheered at the fact that he was leaving. And in my entire career, I'd never heard of or seen such a blatant sign of disrespect.
Mm.
And the first thought that went through my mind was, what do I have to do to keep that from happening to me 2 years from now when I leave this ship? And the second thought that went through my mind was, as I came up through the ranks and got transferred from one job to the next, I wonder how many of my sailors secretly cheered that I was leaving.
Mm.
And I did not know the answer to that question. And because I didn't know it, it told me I didn't have the self-awareness that I needed to be a better leader.
Mm.
And I grew up in the Navy, top down, command and control, my way or the highway type leadership, because that's what I learned. But when I saw my predecessor getting cheered off the ship, it hit me, what's keeping me from changing?
Mm.
And in the surface community of the US Navy, we had a saying that we like to eat our young.
Mm,
And when I saw him leaving, I thought, why do we eat our young? Why are we proud of it? And what's keeping me from changing it? And it
mm.
hit, nothing's keeping me from changing it. And so in that moment, it hit me before I could ask my crew to change and improve. I need to change and improve and become a better leader on myself. And so the days of micromanaging, the top-down command and control were gone. And instead, I interviewed every sailor on the ship individually, all 310 of them. I got to know their names, their spouses' names, their children's name, their hometowns. And in these interviews, I said to them, I don't care what your age is. I don't care what your rank is. I don't care how long you've been here. You can come to work every day. And if you have an idea how to improve a process 1%, do not fear raising your hand and telling us about it. And so, what turned our ship from being one of the worst in the Navy to being the best was when I became a better leader and when the crew became more engaged and took ownership of their work.
That's so good. I love that. I wrote a book called Quit Losing Talent a few years ago. And one of the tactics I teach in this book is what I call a talent lock conversation, which is what you had with those 300 plus sailors, locking them into the Army. I remember reading in your book where when you took over, the Navy had a retention problem. They had a recruitment problem. I think on your ship, if I remember correctly from the book, you had some of the highest turnover or lack of reenlistment in the Navy on your ship, and then you took it from there to I think the highest, if I remember correctly. What are some of those things that you did in that conversation, and then after that, that helped you begin to improve your retention, your re-recruitment, right, or your re-enlistment, as they say in the military? If you would share that with our audience.
So, the quarter before I took command, our retention rate was 8%, meaning we were retaining 8% of the sailors eligible to reenlist. And my admiral said to me, Mike, you can't do anything about it. They're leaving because of our low pay. Well,
Mm,
I did exit surveys. I wanted to confirm that low pay was the number one reason why our people were leaving. And pay was important, but it was only number 5 on the list of reasons why they were walking out the door. Number 1 was they didn't feel like they were being treated with respect in the workplace. Number 2, they didn't feel like they were being listened to. Number 3, they didn't feel like they were getting the training they
mm,
needed to do a great job. And number 4, they didn't feel like they were being groomed for increased positions of responsibility. Now, I can't do anything about pay, but you know what I can do? I can focus on those top 4 issues because
yeah.
it doesn't cost taxpayers a dime, and I don't need to get anybody's permission to do it. So that's what I focused on. And I changed the way we retain people in the Navy. And you remember from your days in the Army when you enlist, you typically enlist for a 4 or 6 year contract. And we know when your contract end date is up. Yet in the
Mm,
Navy, we would wait till your last day and say, are you thinking about staying in or are you going to get out? And by
mm,
that time, your mind is already made up. When somebody comes to you and tells you that they're leaving, they didn't make their mind up that morning. They've
mm,
been thinking about it for 3 or 4 months. So I added a different interview. It was a retention interview. In 9 months prior to a sailor's contract end date, that sailor would come up to my cabin for an interview, and I'd ask him or her point blank, are you thinking about staying in or are you going to get out? And if you're thinking about getting out, what is it that we could do now to help you change your mind? And what I heard from sailors was, gee, if you get me this education or put me in this training program or put me in a different job, I'll stay. And when we started, fleet average on retention was 33%. And my goal was to get from 8% to 33%. Every morning, I would wake up and my prayer would be, Dear Lord, please let Ben Fold be average today. That's
mm,
all I wanted to do was to be average. But by interviewing every sailor individually, 9 months prior to the contract end date, I could pretty much get them what they were looking for. And my last year in command, our retention rate was almost 100%. And we had the highest retention of any ship in the Navy that year. And it's just focusing on one person at a time. And what I found out was it's cheaper to retain the people you already have than to lose them and have to go out and find replacements and train them. And
Amen.
so everybody in leadership needs to realize they're on the retention and recruiting committee, which is what I'm sure you talk about in your book.
Yeah, it's so key. Lead up listeners, listen to what Captain Abraham is sharing here. It's all about getting to know your people, right? Communicating with them versus, in my experience, Mike, it's the companies do these exit interviews. And then, it's easy for the candidate to say, well, or the person who's leaving, the exiting employee, to say, well, I took another job, got more money, right? Well, in reality, this is what I teach. They're typically leaving that job for a very similar job for very similar pay. It's not enough to make a significant difference in their life most of the time.
They're
And
leaving their
so
frontline supervisors, what they're leaving.
yeah, absolutely right. But these leaders and these organizations, they use that as an excuse to not improve from the status quo, right? To not get better. What was the decision you made in your life? How did you make it? Number one, because look, I've been in the military. I know what it's like to be, top down, bureaucratic, don't rock the boat. You knew you had 2 years. You could have easily said, I don't want to leave like that guy, right? But I don't want to mess things up either. How did you make that decision in your life as a leader to say, okay, I'm responsible. I own this. I'm going to make this better. And then what were the little mini steps you began to make that happen?
It was the realization that I was responsible for 310 lives. And when I made that realization, it hit me, you know what? I don't care if I ever get promoted again. I stopped focusing on my next promotion. And instead, what drove me every day was never having to write the parents of any of my sailors telling them that their sons or daughters weren't coming home because we didn't give it our best.
Mm,
So what drove me was not a career decision, it was a performance decision that I can't keep this ship safe on my own. I need help from 310 people. And I need them to have the same sense of ownership, the same sense of urgency. And I can't order that. I have to cultivate it. And
mm.
so every day, I called it romancing the stone. It was a Michael Douglas movie, but
Yeah.
um, it's about romancing your people, letting them know that you appreciate them and that they matter to you. And when captains are out walking around the ship in the Navy, we're usually looking for sailors screwing off so we could reprimand them. I wanted to look for sailors doing something great so that I could thank them. I can't pay them anymore, but you know what I can do? I can catch them in the act of doing something great
Mm.
and look them in the eye and say, thanks for going the extra mile. And that's what I had in my toolkit. So when I took command, I stopped focusing on the things I couldn't influence. I can't pay them anymore, but you know what I can do? I can be seen by them to take an active interest in their career and in their goals, and maybe they'll stay with us longer.
Yeah, I love that. I call that a praise raise. And like, we can't always, I'm not in, look, a lot of leaders, they actually throw, their corporations under the bus a lot of times. Well, I can't raise your pay. I would if I could. But really what they're doing is abdicating that responsibility of leadership, right? Well, I
Yeah.
can't give you a pay raise, so I'm not going to get better as a leader, is really what they're saying. They don't say that out loud, but that's really what they're saying. You've got a quote in your book. It says most obstacles that limit people's potential are set in motion by the leader and rooted in his or her own fears, ego, needs, and unproductive habits. What do you mean by that? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's it's tough leading, putting yourself out there. And I would always try to put myself in the boots of my sailors and look at me through their eyes. And where I got that from, I was out walking around one day, talked to a sailor, and he says, Captain, we have a term to describe the organization on this ship. He said, this ship is like a tree full of monkeys. He said, you're the monkey at the top of the tree. On every branch, there's different levels of monkeys, and we're the monkeys in the bottom branch. He said, whenever you look down from the top of the tree, all you ever see are smiling faces coming back at you. When we look up from the bottom branch, we have an entirely different view of the organization. And so when that sailor said that to me for the first time, I started putting myself in their boots, viewing the organization through their eyes. And it was then I realized I've got a multicultural workforce. I've got a multi-generational workforce, and each group speaks a different language. And here I'd been trying to communicate to them in my language instead of communicating to them in the language that they understand. So I realized that I needed to connect with each group on the ship. So I needed to up my game as a communicator to let them know where we're going, why it's important, but most importantly, why it's in their own best interest that they get on board. And so I used the interviews to try to connect our people to our purpose so that they knew that what they were doing was important and they could be proud of it. And my own fears, um, I was insecure every day in command of that ship
Hmm.
because I was trying a new leadership model and I didn't know if it was going to work because I had never seen it done before. And once the success started happening, I started to gain more confidence in myself. And when I had more confidence in myself, that enabled me to take a little bit more risk and put more trust and faith in my frontline people.
Mm.
And so, and they responded by delivering. And so once we created that trust between us, we got to a higher level of performance.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me of Nick Saban doing an interview, I don't know, it's back a few years, I don't know how long ago it was, but he said, when he made the transition from being a transactional coach to a relational coach, that's when everything changed for him, right? And it's very easy as a leader, a coach, to be very transactional. I'm recruiting you to play this position, to win ball games, to not make mistakes, versus I'm recruiting you to get to know you. What are your dreams, aspirations in life? What are your goals outside of the football field, right? Very much different leadership. And I know the leaders who, yeah, I often say, Mike, I grew up, I know my listeners probably get tired of hearing this. I grew up in a very dysfunctional, violent, abusive home. And so I really couldn't trust, the leaders that I grew up with. But there were a couple leaders when I was in the Army that took a keen interest in me, and they're part of the reason I'm where I'm at today, right? A major gave me a book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, because he's like, Mike, you got a lot of potential as a leader. I'm loud, if you can't tell. I'm aggressive. I'm assertive. The military worked well for me because you can fall behind your rank if you want to do that. I didn't want to be that kind of leader, but I had a major who challenged me, and he gave me that Seven Habits book, started me on a growth journey. I was 23 at the time, and since have, read hundreds of books, had thousands of hours of coaching and counseling, whatever it takes to get to where I'm at today, to let go of some of those egos. Because like you just mentioned, I had this fear of being found out, right? Like I'm not good enough, or I don't know what I'm talking about. So I had this facade of I knew everything, but it was when I was able to begin to let go of that control, having to know all the answers, starting asking, ask for those things, then that's where my leadership began to change. I got to fix my camera here. It caught my hand motion. Sorry about that. So talk about that a little bit. How did you begin? You had this philosophy, it's your ship. Meaning, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll let you describe what that means. But how did you decide, like, it's your ship? And then how do you really give up that control to your team and create that ownership and trust and buy-in for the direction you wanted to go?
So I found that the more control I gave up, the greater command I got over the ship.
Mm.
Counterintuitive, but that's what happened. And I'll never forget in one of the early interviews, an engineer was in, and he asked me how to do a procedure. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, you're the engineer. Why are you asking me how to do this? And then it hit me. He wanted me to tell him how to do it so that if it didn't work out, he could just say, I was just doing what I was told to do.
That's right.
And so instead of telling him how to do it, I said, well, what do you think?
Mm.
If you own this ship, how would you do this? And he says, his first response is, well, Captain, nobody on this ship has ever asked me to think before. And I said, how would you do this? He says, well, this is what I would do. I said, do it. He turned in better performance than if I told him how to do it because he owned it. And what do you, so from that day forward, I stopped telling sailors how to do things. And instead, I would lay out the requirements. And what do you think became, it's your ship. This is your ship. You own it. If you see something that needs to be done, step up and do it to the best of your ability. And, we're very successful, or we wouldn't be here, and your listeners are successful. But you had a lot of help, and I had a lot of help.
Amen.
And nobody gets to where we are on our own. Sure, we work hard. Sure, we're intellectually curious, but every one of us has had a coach or a mentor that took us under their wing. And so what I wanted to do was to be the role model to my crew that my role model was to me. And so when you view yourself as a role model and a coach and mentor, and that you're paying it forward of what somebody invested in you years ago, that's how you get the confidence to be a better leader.
Yeah, it's so critical. I always, I tell leaders, look, you could be that first mentor. I just had a coaching session earlier this morning with a leader that I'm working with, and she's got a young employee on her team she was complaining about, and I'm like, you could be that first person's mentor. They haven't been led well in their life up until today. That's your job to teach them some of those life skills, even just communication skills that they've never had before. Um, you
And the
know,
most asked question I get from audiences is how do you connect with the younger generation? Well, it's complicated, but what I have found out, the younger generation does not want to be told how to do things.
that's right.
Lay out the requirements for them, let them figure it out. And they may be perfect, they may come up a little bit short, but guess what? We're not perfect. We're
Yeah.
still making mistakes. Then ask them what they learned from it and what would they do differently next time if they see it again. Make them self-diagnose, and then they own the solution as opposed to us telling them how to improve where they don't own it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there's a lot of teaching there. I mean, first of all, it's just letting go as a leader of your ego, right? Of like of being wrong. I mean, most leaders don't want to give up that control because they're afraid they're going to be wrong or they're going to have to report a mistake up to their boss. And also, I love what Captain Abrashoff shared earlier about ask questions first. So many leaders, when someone comes in with a problem, they start giving solutions versus, well, what have you tried so far, right? I just love that question. Like, Mike, what have you done so far that didn't work? Because I don't want to give the if I give you advice that you've tried so far, guess what? I'm just an idiot, right? I don't know what I'm talking about. But if I ask what you've done, we can modify that, or I can give you a new piece of advice, or help you find a new solution on your own. That's so important. Certainly, you face challenges in changing the culture of an organization. And you and I were talking about this before we started our recording about many leaders, they set out this 5 year strategic plan, right? They spend a year in the organization, then they decide, okay, we need to have a strategic planning meeting. Let's put a plan out for 5 years to really transform our culture. You did it in 2 years, and I know there were challenges in that. I'd love for you to talk to the audience about, how to speed up that transformation, but also how to overcome challenges and resistance during that transformation.
Well, I took command and we were to arrive in the Arabian Gulf in 3 months. And when I took command, we weren't we weren't the worst ship, but we weren't nearly where we needed to be if we were ever called upon. And so I had a sense of urgency that we had to be combat ready the day we arrived in the Arabian Gulf. And I came to the conclusion that I can't order excellence sitting in the captain's chair, and I can't do it on my own. And so that's where the idea to interview every sailor, I interviewed all 310 of them, and they weren't interrogations, they were just conversations. And I had a
Mhm.
photo taken of every sailor. I had an index card. I stapled that photo to the index card, and I asked them, where they were from, what their goals were, why they were in the Navy, why they joined the Navy. Here's a question: if you want to see somebody's eyes light up, what are you most proud of in your life
Mm,
that nobody at work here knows anything about?
so
And that's
good.
where you get a window into their soul
Hmm.
and find out what drives them. And then after every interview, I would just write it down. And when I had a free moment, I would flip through my index cards, and that's how I learned the name of every sailor, their face, their job, what they were most proud of, so that if I see them in the passageway, I can chat them up and let them know that I care about them. And if your people know that you care about them, man, they'll follow you into battle. And so that's what it was all about, was having a sense of urgency that we got 3 months in order to turn this around. And when I first started out, what I got back was, well, that's the way we've always done it. And I banned that from the lips of my sailors. You are no longer authorized to say that's the way we've always done it on this ship.
Mm.
And so it was, kickstarting the organization and letting them know that, showtime is in 3 months, and let's get on with it.
Love it. You just talked about something I want to transition into: innovation, right? A lot of organizations, they give lip service to innovation. I have organizations I work with, one of their values might be innovation, meaning they want new ideas, but they really don't want them. They just want, give lip service to that value. Talk about being innovative in an organization like the Navy, where it's not easy to make change. I'd love for you to share the story about painting the ship, and the innovative ideas that came from that, and how that began to transform not just your ship, the morale, the engagement in that, but also the culture of the Navy as a whole. Because you were a small vessel in the bigger organization, and what I really want to do is be able to challenge that director that I'm working with in a organization. They feel like they can't really make change happen because well, I just lead here in this department. But what I'm really trying to get them to do is, let's start here, because that will begin to change the organization as a whole when things begin to work out for you. So I'd love for
Well,
you to speak at it from that angle.
we have roughly 300 ships in the Navy, and it's a 300,000 person organization. And we have standard operating procedures that every command has to abide by. And
Mm-hmm.
I can't break the rules whenever I want. But you know what I can do? In every interview, I would say, I don't care what your age is. I don't care what your rank is. I don't care how long you've been here. If you have an idea how to improve a process 1%, I want to hear from you. We weren't about radical change. It was just improving 1% a day. I said, our goal is to be 1% better today than we were yesterday, and to be 1% better tomorrow than we are today. And if we can do that, then nobody's going to touch us. So it wasn't about radical transformation. It was about improving on the processes we already have and getting 1% better a day. And so that became part of our mindset. And when the crew knew that they didn't have to fear us giving us an idea, but I wanted them to give us their ideas out of respect for each other and out of respect for their chain of command. And I had a public address microphone right at my desk. And in the interviews, if I got a great idea from a sailor, I'd hit the button and I'd say, Benfold, this is the captain. This is the idea I just got. This is who I got it from. It makes sense to me. I want your full support. We're going to implement it right now. And it wasn't until after I left the ship that I found out that one of the nicknames the crew had for me was Mega Mike, because they said there wasn't a microphone I couldn't walk past without talking into it. But that's what leaders do, is communicate, and you have a sense of urgency, and you connect people to purpose, and then set them free. And my crew never once let me down. I never ceased to be amazed at what they could accomplish.
Yeah, that's really good. Talk about the painting the ship story and how it kind of changed some things going forward.
So one sailor comes in and says, do you know how many times we've painted this ship in the last 12 months? And I said, no. And he said, 6 times. And he said, every time we paint the ship, it takes us a month to paint it. So every other month we're painting the ship.
Hmm.
He said, have you ever painted your home? And I said, yes. And he said, it sucks, doesn't it? And I said, what's your point? We've been painting ships for 249 years. He said, did you ever stop to notice why we have to paint the ship every other month? He said, whenever a new piece of equipment is added topside to the hull of this ship, It's being held in place with nuts, bolts, screws, washers, and fasteners that are made out of ferrous metal that rust in salt water. And when it rusts, it streaks rust stains down the side of the ship. He said, have you ever heard of stainless steel? And I said, you mean the stuff that doesn't rust in salt water? And, I walked past this my first 16 years in the Navy, shipping and painting. It's the way we've always done it. I had that mindset. It's the way we've always done it. When this sailor pointed it out to me, it hit me. I've got sailors hanging from the mast of this ship in a safety harness doing $5 an hour work. I've got sailors hanging over the side of the ship in a life preserver doing $5 an hour work. And what would happen if somebody got injured doing or killed during $5 an hour work? And it's like, if I just reduce the number of times we have to do this, I can reduce the opportunity for my sailors to have an accident. Mm-hmm. So we scoured the globe looking for the right materials to change this stuff out with, spent about $25,000, changed out everything we could, painted the ship. We did not have to paint the ship again for the next 10 months. That's and awesome. It came from a 21-year-old sailor who, instead of, painting over rust, asked what creates the rust in the first place. And so what I tell audiences, there's rust in every organization. And the key is not to paint over it, but to figure out what's causing it and get rid of it.
That's so good. Yeah, I'm sure the paint supplier was disappointed because he didn't sell as much paint, right?
Well, our ship was home ported in San Diego. Yeah. And the state of California has environmental rules that if you drop oil or paint into the bay, I can be personally liable for a $10,000 fine. Not paid by the Navy, paid by me. And so that was an added incentive.
Absolutely.
That we reduce the opportunity to drop fuel into the bay or drop paint into the bay, because I don't have $10,000 to give to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's another good reason to make that change for sure. Let's talk about leaders today, Captain Abershoff, and they want change, but and look, your ideas, they're not new, right? They've been around for a long time. It's servant leadership based. But we still have a huge need in the world for great leadership today. I mean, there's a lot of room for improvement. If you just, and I don't want to get political, but top down, right? From all angles, we can get better at leadership. What do you say to those leaders right now that are they know they need to shift to this model of bottom up leadership versus top down leadership, more servant based leadership, but it's just so hard because I've been leading the way I've been leading for a long time. And it's hard. I mean, even for you, right? You're in this top down bureaucracy of leadership, and then you go in and you finally got your first ship and you want to shift everything. What's your advice for those leaders today that really need to make that shift into how the organization is led?
So the second biggest event of my life happened the 2nd of August, 1990. And I was stationed on a ship 100 miles south of Kuwait the morning Saddam Hussein invaded. And at 4:30 that morning, we detected 21 unknown fighters coming directly at our ship. We sound the general quarters alarm, and I get to my radar screen, and I'm looking at these 21 fighters, and I'm thinking, we'll be able to shoot down many of them, but I gave us only a 50% chance of being able to shoot down all 21. And we tracked these fighters, and just as we were ready to fire the first missile, they hung a right turn into Saudi Arabia. And we later found out it was the Kuwaiti Air Force fleeing Kuwait that morning. But for several minutes, we thought we were the ones who were under attack. And after the excitement died down, I started thinking, I don't like a 50% chance of survival. I wonder what we could have or should have been doing differently while we had the chance to put ourselves in a position to control our own destiny. And I thought about the previous year, the year we were supposed to be spending preparing to take our ship to the Middle East. And in that previous year, we did just enough to get by, but not enough to be great. And in that previous year, we spent more time fighting among ourselves and finger pointing than we did working together as a team.
Mhm.
Training was always the lowest priority. And we did things because of tradition, and that's the way we've always done it, instead of developing an intellectually curious crew, how we get to the next higher level. And I made a resolution to myself that day that if I'm ever given the opportunity to lead again, I'm not going to squander it, because you never know when you might not get a second chance. And no organization on this planet today, whether it's private or commercial or government or military, no organization's success is guaranteed. You got to go out and fight for it every day, and you got to go out and earn it every day. And if you don't have an intellectually curious workforce and constantly striving to improve and have each other's back and communicate, you're not going to develop the best organization, and then you're at risk of bad things happening.
Yeah, that's so good. There's a story you share in the book that I think would be helpful for our listeners. You were put into a role. I can't remember exactly what role it was, but in your words, you kind of sucked at it, and you got some bad, you got some good advice in maybe a bad way. The leader that was coaching you to get better was basically telling you were terrible. And you took that, and by the end of that, the story that you shared was, by the end of that, that same commander that gave you some words of advice, you better get better, you're going to get fired. He ended up telling you you were one of the best ever. So how do you share with leaders, maybe young up and coming people today, young up and coming leaders, how to like take advice and use it as a propellant to growth versus use it as a killer and a place to leave them in that place of not being good enough? Because I know not all leaders are good at coaching. We would love that if they were, but not all leaders are good at coaching. But how are you able to take that as advice to make you become better, that maybe you can transfer some of that wisdom into some of these young leaders today?
So it was my first department head tour, and I was assigned a ship that was one of the most technologically advanced in the Navy, and I did not have the training for it.
Hmm.
And I was one of three department heads, and when we're at sea doing an operation, the three department heads run the ship, and it's shift work, 4 or 6 hours on, 12 hours off. And my first 3 days at sea doing my first operation, it was a shit show.
Mm.
And I was just struggling to get through my 6 hour shift. And then I would turn over a piece of crap to the department head who came behind me. And after 3 days of watching me, the captain brings me into his cabin and says, "Look, Mike, it's not enough for you to get through your watch. You have to spend your watch preparing so that the guy who replaces you doesn't have to lift a finger for his 6 hours, except to prepare for the guy who replaces him. And if you guys can get to that place, we're going to have a smooth running operation where you're all set up when you take over. You just set up for the next guy to be successful when you come." So in the Navy, the performance of ships is often based on the personality of the commanding officer. And I've seen ships completely fall apart the day a commanding officer leaves, because it was all done by his or her force of personality,
Mm.
as opposed to putting in sustainable processes and procedures. And I've often felt that a commanding officer's final fitness report should be written a year after they leave command,
Yeah.
because that would force you to plan for the future and prepare that new captain doesn't have to lift a finger for the first year, except prepare for his or her relief.
Hmm.
So it changes your perspective. And so that was it was painful getting that feedback from my captain,
Yeah.
but he was right. And I could either cry about it or I could figure out how to get better. And so I went to my books, and I became technologically competent at the job. And you're right. When I did leave, he said, we were the best ever for running those watches. And so for young people today, first and foremost, you have to be technically competent at your craft. And then if you want to climb that ladder of success, you have to demonstrate the ability to either lead projects, lead teams, lead patients, customers, whatever. And if you can demonstrate the ability to get greater results, leading a bigger scope of operation, that's how you climb the ladder of success. And you need to be preparing for that day now, to be working on your technical competency while also being aware of what type of leader you want to be when you get that job. And you can learn from poor leaders and resolve never to be like them, or you could learn from great leaders and say, that's how I want to lead.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. Love that. I love that philosophy of leave it better than you found it, right? And that's what you're talking about here when you become a leader. How do I make this place better so the person who takes my place has a much easier job than I did when I took over? And that doesn't mean we're always taking over bad stuff, right? Even if we're taking
Right.
over a good place, let's leave it better for the next person, because we're just stewards. You know, we're stewards. You were a steward for 2 years before you moved on. I still think that's crazy that you only get to command a ship for 2 years, because you know a lot of times it takes the first year just to get to know where the bathroom is sometimes, right? For some people. But I love it. Hey, I love this conversation, Captain Abrashoff. Thanks for being a guest on Lead Up Podcast. This has been a great. I'd love. We could probably talk 2 or 3 hours and never run out of things to say. But
Mike, can I have one final comment?
absolutely.
I love what I do. I go around the country speaking to corporations and businesses. Last week, I was at an LNG plant in the Bayou of Louisiana, speaking to all frontline supervisors. I bet you I spoke to 3,000 that day.
Mm.
After one of my presentations, a young man came up to me and said, your book has made a tremendous impact on me. He said, I read it 2 years ago when I was in prison.
Oh wow.
And nobody has ever said that to me. I didn't know my book was even in prisons. But 2 years later, that young man is in a supervisory role at a critical LNG plant. And it's like, it just goes to show you that if you're intellectually curious and want to strive to get to the next level, man, that's how you get satisfaction out of your life. And that's how you make an impact on others. So I'll leave you with that closing thought from that young man who I'm very proud of his
Yeah.
trajectory that he's on right now.
Yeah, I love that. You know, we never know when we're going to get the opportunity to impact somebody, right? I can honestly say, as I shared earlier about my childhood growing up, you know, it's that one leader that took an interest in me, right? That kind of propelled me to begin to be intellectually curious myself,
Yep.
and set me on a growth journey that I'm still on, you know, some 30 plus years later. And I'm grateful for that. And your book and, you know, this podcast will impact people. How do people find your book? How do they hear from you more? Are there other podcasts, YouTube places that they can find you to learn more about your philosophy of leadership?
My book is on Amazon. It's Your Ship. And you can Google me, Mike Abrashoff, and I'm on YouTube all over the place. And I've got a consulting group, apgleadership.com. And so, yeah, it's a great journey.
APG,
Yep.
apgleadership.com.
Leadership.com.
Okay, we'll make sure, listeners, we drop a link to Mike on LinkedIn and also his website in the show notes. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Captain Mike Abrashoff. It's Your Ship, Management Techniques from the Best Damn Ship in the Navy. It's a fantastic book. I'm going to continue to read it and devour it. It's life lessons. As I said to Mike earlier, I don't know if I said it in this podcast or in the green room. It's like 7 Habits. It's principles that stand the test of time, or any industry or any job that you're in. There are things that we can go back to as leaders and continue to grow. Captain, I appreciate you being on the show today. Thanks for being a great guest on the Lead Up
You got it,
Podcast.
Mike. Thanks for having me.